Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 358 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. As this is episode 358, I think it is only fitting that we talk about the .35 caliber bore diameter. So in this episode, I discuss all of the .35 caliber SAAMI standardized rifle cartridges, plus a few more in that bore diameter that are interesting. With just a few exceptions, these cartridges use .358 caliber bullets. Hence the topic of this particular episode, number 358. I talk about their history, design characteristics, performance specs, strengths and weaknesses, and recommended uses in detail. Where appropriate, I will also share some personal anecdotes involving these rounds, as well as some observations involving various cartridges by some noteworthy gun writers as well. Now, the resources I used in making this episode include the book The Rifle in America by Philip B. Sharp, the 17th edition of Cartridges of the World, edited by Todd Woodard, Any Shot You Want by Art Alphen, African Rifles and Cartridges by John Taylor, and the Hornady, Nosler, and Lyman Reloading Manuals. Now, before we get started, I want to know what you want to hear from me in future episodes. So if you listen on Spotify, leave a comment on this episode with topic requests for the future. If you listen on Apple, leave a review with your topic requests. Make sure you give the show a 5-star rating while you're at it. Now, these requests can be about anything in the hunting and shooting world. They can be about Africa. They can be about future all-encompassing caliber roll-ups like this, caliber comparisons, interviews, whatever. Just tell me what you want, and I'll do my best to give it to you. Also, make sure you are on my email list. If you like the podcast, you will love the emails I send out every weekday about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. Sign up at the link in the show notes or at biggamehuntingpodcast.com/ebook. Now, I know these caliber roll-up episodes are very popular. Ever since I published episode 286 on all of the .30 caliber cartridges back in 2023, I have received a constant stream of requests from listeners asking for more. Well, here you go. We'll start today with the .348 Winchester. Now, I know this isn't really a .35 caliber cartridge, but this round is something of an odd duck in terms of bore size, and there's really nowhere else to put it, so I'm putting it here. And really, because it uses .348 caliber bullets, it's pretty darn close to a .35 caliber cartridge. In any case, the .348 Winchester was developed by Winchester for their Model 71 lever-action rifle. This is the only cartridge ever produced for that rifle. Now, the Model 71 is basically a modernized and strengthened Winchester Model 1886 rifle. Winchester introduced this rifle in 1936, eventually discontinued it in 1958. Browning also made a small number of Browning lever-action rifles in .348 Winchester as well. This is one of the most powerful rimmed cartridges ever designed for a lever-action rifle. Like I mentioned earlier, it shoots .348-inch bullets. SAAMI spec is 40,000 copper units of pressure. Cartridge is 2.795 inches long, has a rimmed case, .610-inch rim diameter, .574-inch case head diameter, and this has a very highly tapered case. Winchester originally introduced the cartridge with 150 grain and 250 grain loads, but they have since been dropped. Currently, Hornady produces a 200 grain loading with an FTX bullet at 2,560 feet per second in their Lever Evolution line. That's about 2,900 foot-pounds of energy. Buffalo Bore also makes a 250 grain loading at 2,250 feet per second for just over 2,800 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. This is a very heavy-hitting lever gun round. Now, like most of the cartridges I'm going to talk about in this episode, it's not very capable at longer range, but that is not what it is designed for. Winchester's idea with this cartridge was to make a single cartridge suitable for everything in North America, from deer all the way up to grizzly, and brown bear. And really, the 348 Winchester accomplished that mission. And you could very reasonably hunt any species of game in the continent with this cartridge. Now, unfortunately for this cartridge, the timing was not great with it. They introduced it in 1936. That was the same year Winchester also introduced their Model 70 bolt-action rifle. Maybe you've heard of it. This is not to say that the Model 71 or the 348 Winchester were big failures for the company, but they were nowhere near as successful as the Model 70 and those higher-powered, more modern designed cartridges that were very popular with that rifle. And really, the reason why this cartridge and the rifle have both faded was more of a result of a general trend away from lever-action rifles towards bolt-action rifles in general. The cartridge is still out there, still hanging around. There's a very dedicated following of people who absolutely love it, though. My dad really likes lever-action rifles, and among many other lever-action rifles and cartridges, he owned a Model 71 in 348 Winchester for a time when I was in high school and killed a couple deer with it. Now, this cartridge was the basis for the 50 Alaskan and 500 line ball cartridges. Now, for the 50 Alaskan in particular, there was a guy named Harold Johnson who necked up the 348 Winchester to use .510 caliber bullets. As the story goes, he initially started loading this new 50 Alaskan cartridges using 720 grain boat tail 50 BMG bullets. He would cut them in half, take the rear half of the bullet, and then seat it upside down in the case. Those 450 grain projectiles apparently penetrated like nobody's business. He said that quote-unquote solid bullet would penetrate completely through even the biggest brown bear from any direction, and he said that he has never recovered any of those bullets ever from a bear or a moose, no matter what angle or what range he shot the animal at. Okay, so that's it for the 348 Winchester. Let's move on to the next round on the list, which is the 357 Magnum cartridge. Now, I am focusing on rifle cartridges in this episode, but the 357 Magnum is one of those rounds that lives in both the handgun and rifle worlds. The 357 was designed as a joint venture between Winchester and Smith & Wesson in 1935. Among other people, Elmer Keith and my boy Phil Sharp worked on this project. They basically took a .38 Special handgun cartridge and loaded it hotter. Now, to prevent someone from firing this new 357 Magnum cartridge in an older .38 Special handgun and possibly damaging it or injuring themselves in the process, the designers lengthened the 357 Magnum case by just a tiny bit. So it's just long enough where you cannot chamber a 357 Magnum cartridge in a .38 Special revolver. But you can shoot .38 Special ammo in a 357 Magnum firearm. Now, a typical hunting load for a 357 Magnum is going to be shooting a 158 grain bullet at around 1,250 feet per second out of an 8-inch long revolver barrel. For reference, the older .38 Special will fire the same weight bullet at around 800 to 900 feet per second, depending on barrel length. Maybe even slower than that out of a snub-nosed revolver. So the 357 Magnum is quite a bit more powerful than the .38 Special. Now, the 357 Magnum is a rimmed, straight-walled cartridge, 1.59-inch overall length, 1.29-inch case length, and it shoots .357 caliber bullets. This was the most powerful handgun cartridge in the world until the .44 Magnum came along later. This cartridge was very popular among law enforcement and among people using it for self-defense for a long time. It's not as popular in those roles as it used to be, but it's also still in pretty common use too. Now, the military also used the cartridge for a little bit in some roles, and the cartridge has also made the crossover into the hunting world. It works fine out of a handgun on deer size game, but this is a cartridge where you can get a pretty good boost in velocity when shooting it out of a carbine. For instance, you shoot that same 158 grain bullet out of a 16-inch long barrel, and your velocity could get as high as 16, maybe even 1,700 feet per second. Among other companies, Hornady offers a loading for the 357 Magnum in their Lever Evolution line with a 140 grain FTX bullet. Barnes also makes a load with a 140 grain XPB. Barnes only advertises 1265 for that velocity, but that's from a 4-inch long pistol barrel. So like I said, you can get that going a couple hundred feet per second faster out of a carbine of one kind or another. Now, speaking of rifles, Winchester currently produces their model 1873 and 1892 rifles in 357 Magnum. Same thing with the Marlin 1894. Henry, Cimarron, a couple of other companies also make lever-action rifles in this chambering too. It is somewhat common for people to have a 357 Magnum caliber carbine and a revolver of one kind or another, so you can use the same ammo in each one. And, of course, Thompson Center also made their Contender pistol in 357 Magnum, among other calibers. Now, a full house 357 Magnum loading can be kind of snappy, a little bit difficult to control out of a handgun, especially a smaller handgun, but it's still not terrible. And of course, if you're shooting it out of a larger handgun, then it of course is easier, and out of a rifle, not bad at all. This is a good short-range cartridge for hunting game like deer, and you're going to hear me say that a lot in this episode. Now, moving on, we have the 35 Winchester self-loading. This is not a SAAMI standardized cartridge, but there's an interesting legacy associated with it. This cartridge was designed for the Winchester Model 1905 auto-loading rifle. Winchester wanted to beat Remington to the punch with the first centerfire auto-loading rifle to hit the market. Now, they did succeed with this rifle. They succeeded in beating Remington anyway. That rifle had a blowback action. Now, firearms with a blowback action are very simple to design and manufacture. In these cases, the bolt is held closed by the weight of the bolt itself and the spring. Put very, very simply, a firearm with a simple blowback action like this holds the bolt closed just long enough for the bullet to leave the barrel, and then at that point, the pressure generated by firing that cartridge opens the bolt, goes to the rear, ejects the spent cartridge, and then the spring pushes that bolt forwards, at which point it strips a new cartridge from the magazine and chambers it. So like I said, the bolt is held closed by the sheer weight of the bolt itself and the recoil spring. There's no physical locking mechanism to keep the bolt closed. While firearms using this design principle are pretty simple to design and build, the downside of using them is that you need a heavier bolt and a stiffer recoil spring in order for them to function safely and reliably. And the more powerful of a cartridge you are using in this firearm, the heavier of a bolt and the heavier of a recoil spring you will need. And there quickly reaches a point where if you're dealing with stuff that is too powerful, you need a spring and a bolt that are so big and heavy that it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to cycle the action manually. So for that reason, simple blowback firearms are pretty much restricted to lower powered cartridges. For instance, the Ruger 1022 in 22 long rifle uses a simple blowback design. There are a number of pistols that also use a simple blowback design too. Well, the Model 1905 Winchester and the related Model 1907 and 1910 rifles that came along later were all simple blowback designs. Well, like I just mentioned, the 35 Winchester self-loading was not a very popular or powerful cartridge. This round fired a 180 grain 35 caliber bullet at about 1,390 feet per second, so about 775 foot-pounds of energy. Phil Sharp had this to say about it: "It is of inadequate power for any practical purpose except for the smallest of game. It should never be used on game as large as a deer or small bear." End of quote. Well, Winchester introduced another cartridge called the 351 Winchester self-loading in 1907 with their Model 1907 auto-loading rifle. This was an improvement on the 35 self-loading. The .351 Winchester self-loading was also a semi-rimmed cartridge, very similar to the .35 self-loading, just had a longer case, and it was also more powerful. Fired the same 180 grain bullet, just faster, at 1,850 feet per second in this case, so about 1,350, 1,360 foot-pounds of energy. This particular rifle was somewhat popular with police departments in the USA, and they used it at that time as a patrol rifle, and the rifle had a 10-round magazine. So this is what police departments used in the early 20th century in the USA in the role that they sometimes use the AR-15 in now, long before the AR-15. Now, both the Thompson submachine gun and the Model 1907 Winchester both became infamous during the mobster era of the 1930s. For instance, a guy named Homer Van Meter was a member of the Dillinger gang. Maybe you've heard of John Dillinger. Well, Homer's weapon of choice was a modified Model 1907 in .351 Winchester self-loading. He used that rifle in that caliber to murder Patrolman Howard Wagner outside the Merchants National Bank in South Bend, Indiana, in June of 1934. Now, 1934 was a wild year, notorious for lots of bank robberies and police shootouts. Dillinger himself was killed that year. Same thing with Babyface Nelson, Bonnie and Clyde. The police also killed Homer Van Meter in August of that same year. I've also heard that a member of the posse that killed Bonnie and Clyde in 1934 was using a Model 1907 in .351 Winchester. Anyway, this cartridge is obsolete. It has not been produced since the 1950s or thereabouts. It works fine as a short-range woods cartridge on deer-sized game, but that's really about all I'd recommend it for. Now, my dad actually owned a Model 1907 in this cartridge. He did kill some deer with it. He said that despite the lower-powered nature of the cartridge, the rifle kicked like a mule. In describing the recoil, he said it felt like you would get an initial kick when the gun would fire, which was then followed almost immediately by an even harder hit when the heavy, movable action would slam to the rear of the rifle and then move forward, cycling another round. In that same vein, a lot of these rifles were prone to having the forend crack. And he said probably about half of the Model 1907 rifles he'd seen over the years had a cracked forearm. And due to the nature of their construction, they would balance pretty far forward, and the rifle itself was pretty heavy at about 8.5 pounds. So you have a rifle that balances far forward, is heavy at 8.5 pounds, and is shooting a lower-powered cartridge, but despite all of that, the rifle was still unpleasant to shoot and had a lot of recoil. So as you can imagine, these cartridges have fallen by the wayside over the years. They are certainly unique rifles and cartridges, though. Okay, now we are going to jump from the 1930s almost all the way up to present day and discuss a very different cartridge, the 350 Legend. Now, this is a straight-walled cartridge Winchester released in 2019 to fill a particular niche in the hunting world. Specifically, some Midwestern states only permit hunters to use straight-walled cartridges during their rifle deer seasons. So what is a straight-walled cartridge? Just like the name says, it is a cartridge utilizing a case with straight walls. That is in contrast to a bottlenecked cartridge like a 308, 30-06, or even a 30-30, where the rear portion of the case is fatter and then it has a distinct neck that steps down to a smaller diameter. Now, the idea here is these states wanted to allow hunters to use lower-powered cartridges that are, in theory anyway, safer for the general public in terms of the maximum range of the projectiles they will shoot. The exact details vary from state to state, but most of these jurisdictions specify that hunters must use something along the lines of a straight-walled cartridge, .357 caliber or larger for deer hunting. I think in many cases, they technically had pistol cartridges in mind when they made that rule, so a .44 Magnum or a .357 Magnum would be legal. Same thing with a .460 Smith & Wesson. To that point, some states, like Indiana, prohibit cartridges with a case longer than 1.8 inches long. That's the case length of the .460 Smith & Wesson. Well, hunters started to realize that certain rifle cartridges, like the 450 Bushmaster, for instance, or the 4570 in some cases were actually legal to use during those deer seasons. Now, in particular, the folks at Winchester noticed their 450 Bushmaster ammo was selling surprisingly well in a few Midwestern states. They dug into things a little bit and realized that it was getting a lot of use among deer hunters in those so-called straight wall states. Now, the 450 Bushmaster is a great round, but is really quite a bit more powerful than what you would need for deer hunting. Plus, it has quite a bit of recoil, too. So with that in mind, designers at Winchester set about building a cartridge that would still satisfy those legal requirements I just mentioned, and would still be very effective on deer, but would also be more pleasant to shoot. So basically, they were trying to build the optimal deer hunting cartridge that would give hunters an effective, mild recoiling, and reasonably priced alternative to rounds like the 450 Bushmaster that still met the legal requirements of those states. So the 350 Legend was the result. This cartridge does not technically have a parent case, but it looks very similar to a 223 Remington with the neck removed and a 35 caliber bullet stuck in the end of it. SAAMI specs of the cartridge say it uses .357 caliber bullets, has a .378 inch rim diameter, same as the 223 and 556, has a case 1.71 inches long, and has straight walls. Max pressure 55,000 psi. So the end result was a cartridge that met those straight wall state restrictions and also function in an AR-15. Typical ballistics are a 180 grain bullet at around 2,100 feet per second. Similar to, but slightly less powerful than the 35 Remington, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, this is not technically .358 caliber like most other rounds in this episode, but it's basically as close as you can get otherwise. It seems to have been a very successful cartridge, very popular among deer hunters, especially in the Midwest. It's not limited to that geographic region, and it's actually even fairly popular out here where I live in East Texas, for instance. The 350 Legend works great at the ranges most people are using it at. It has very mild recoil, on par with or even a little bit less than a 243. Now, this is not a long-range round by any means, but it's actually also specifically designed not to be a long-range cartridge. But it's wonderful at 100 yards, 200 yards, built for a very specific purpose, but it does great inside those specifications. This cartridge also has a great reputation for accuracy as well. It's available in a lot of rifles. Winchester makes it in their XPR. Savage makes rifles in it. Same thing with Mossberg. You can get it in a Ruger American, a Tikka. You can also get it in the single-shot CVA Scout. And like I mentioned a minute ago, it's also available in an AR-15 if that is your cup of tea. Winchester currently makes 6 loads for the 350 Legend. They make some cheap white box ammo for use at the range. They make some Defender ammo for self-defense. They make a 225 grain subsonic load, and they make 3 hunting loads. They make a 150 grain copper impact at 2260 feet per second, a 150 grain deer season XP at 2,325 feet per second, and a 180 grain PowerPoint at 2,100 feet per second. All of those loads are generating around 1,700 to 1,750 foot-pounds of energy. Federal makes loads for it with a 180 grain PowerPoint at 2,100, 160 grain Fusion at 2,300. Barnes makes a loading with a 170 grain TSX at 2,125 feet per second. Nosler offers it in their Whitetail Country line of ammo with a 180 grain solid base bullet at 2,100 feet per second. Hornady makes a load with 150 grain interlock, 165 grain FTX, 170 grain interlock as well. They also make a 250 grain sub-X loading in their subsonic line. Remington also loads their 180 grain core lock at about 2,100 feet per second for this cartridge. So you got lots of rifle choices, lots of ammo choices. Like I said, great deer hunting cartridge. Designed for a very specific purpose. I give Winchester an A+ for building this cartridge to accomplish that goal. It's not a flexible cartridge, but it is perfect for what it is designed for.
Hi, I'm Chris Gethard, and I'm very excited to tell you about Beautiful Anonymous, a podcast where I talk to random people on the phone. I tweet out a phone number, thousands of people try to call, I talk to one of them, they stay anonymous, I can't hang up, that's all the rules. I never know what's going to happen. We get serious ones. I've talked with meth dealers on their way to prison. I've talked to people who survived mass shootings. Crazy funny ones. I talked to a guy with a goose laugh, somebody who dresses up as a pirate on the weekends. I never know what's going to happen. It's a great show. Subscribe today, Beautiful Anonymous.
Now, speaking of Remington, they rolled out their own straight-walled round in 2023. Dubbed the 360 Buckhammer, this round is basically a 30-30 Winchester necked up to 35 caliber with the case shortened to 1.8 inches long and with the shoulder removed. So this is another straight-walled cartridge, but the thing that really distinguishes it from the 350 Legend is the 360 Buckhammer has a rim and is purposely designed for lever-action rifles. It will also work in single-shot rifles, and in addition to the other Midwestern straight-walled states, the 360 Buckhammer is legal for the new Illinois rifle deer season. This cartridge has an overall length of 2.5 inches, case length of 1.8 inches, 50,000 psi max SAAMI pressure, shoots .359 caliber bullets. But it can basically use the same bullets as all of the other 35 caliber rounds on this list. It's also a tiny bit more powerful than the 350 Legend. Remington makes a couple different loads for it. For instance, 180 grain core lock at 2,400 feet per second for about 2,300 foot-pounds of energy. They also make a 200 grain core lock at 2,200 feet per second, a 180 grain tipped core lock at 2,400 feet per second. Federal offers it in their hammer down line with a 220 grain soft point at 2,000 feet per second. Also make it in the PowerShock line with a 180 grain PowerShock at 2375 and a 200 grain PowerShock at 2200. Like I said, similar to the 350 Legend, also similar to the 35 Remington, which we're about to talk about, a little bit more powerful than both of those rounds though. The 360 Buckhammer is flatter shooting and also has less recoil than something like a 444 Marlin or a 4570. It does have more recoil than a 350 Legend, but recoil is still not bad. Now, Henry Rifles picked up this cartridge right out of the gate. They offer it in a couple of their lever guns. CVA also offers it in their single-shot Scout rifle. And like I said, that is a perfect rifle to use in the new Illinois rifle deer season because you have to use a single-shot rifle that uses a straight-walled cartridge in that state. Basically the same pros, cons, and best use cases as the 350 Legend, just more specifically designed for lever-action rifles and will not work in an AR-15. All right, next up we have the 35 Winchester. This is completely different from the 35 Winchester self-loading and 351 Winchester self-loading I talked about a minute ago. This is a rimmed cartridge designed for the Winchester Model 1895 lever action. Introduced in 1903, this is much more powerful than the two previous Winchester self-loading cartridges, also even more powerful than the 33 Winchester centerfire I mentioned in episode 338. Factory loads shot a 250 grain bullet at about 2150 feet per second. This is another short-range, heavy-hitting round. Great for stuff like deer, also bear, also moose, etc. Completely obsolete though. And it's been obsolete for a long time. Rifles, ammo, really hard to come by. But next cartridge is not obsolete, and in fact, this next cartridge may actually be the most popular cartridge right now today among all of the 35 caliber cartridges. That round is the 35 Remington. Now, remember what I said earlier about Winchester trying to beat Remington to market with an auto-loading centerfire rifle. Well, the Model 8 auto-loading rifle was Remington's foray into that market. Though Winchester was indeed first, but Remington had a better design from none other than John Moses Browning. Now, Remington introduced their Model 8 auto-loading rifle in the early 1900s. And if you look at a Model 8, you might notice that it looks very similar in appearance to a Browning Auto 5 shotgun. That's no accident. Both were designed by John Browning, and they used a lot of the same design principles. Now, while the Winchester Model 1905 was the first centerfire auto-loading rifle released in the USA, the Remington Model 8 was the first commercially successful auto-loading rifle released in the USA. Well, Remington made a whole series of new cartridges for that rifle. As I have mentioned in previous episodes, that lineup of cartridges includes the 25, 30, 32, and the 35 Remington cartridges. All of those rounds, except the 35 Remington, are now obsolete. Remington also offered those same 4 cartridges in their later Model 81 auto-loading rifle. That was basically a modified and improved Model 8 auto-loading rifle. They also offered the 35 Remington in their Model 14 slide action or pump action rifle and their Model 30 bolt action. Other companies made rifles in 35 Remington too. Most notably, Marlin made their Model 336 in this chambering. Winchester also made it in their Model 70 for a short period of time. In fact, of the 18 standard production chamberings for pre-64 Model 70s, the 35 Remington is one of the most rare and collectible calibers. They only made about 400 of them. Because it was made for the auto-loading Model 8, the 35 Remington is a rimless cartridge. But funny enough, that round is most popular today in the lever-action Marlin 336. That is pretty unusual for a rimless round. This is probably the second most popular lever-action cartridge in the country today, behind only the 30-30. The 35 Remington is a SAAMI standardized cartridge, 33,500 PSI max average pressure. Cartridge is 2.525 inches long, has a .460-inch rim diameter, like I said, rimless case. This is a weird in-between size, bigger than AR-15 cartridges, but shorter than the true short-action cartridges like the 308. But it is a product of the rifles it was designed for over a century ago. Now, Frank Hamer famously used a Remington autoloader in 35 Remington during the ambush of Bonnie and Clyde in 1934 that I mentioned earlier. Legend has it that he initiated the ambush by shooting Clyde Barrow in the head through the windshield with that rifle. This is another solid, heavy-hitting, short-range cartridge. Manufacturers have made 35 Remington ammo with 150, 180, and 200 grain bullets over the years, but that 200 grain bullet seems to be the sweet spot and the most popular load for the 35 Remington. The quintessential 35 Remington load fires a 200 grain bullet at about 2,100 feet per second, so about 1950 foot-pounds of energy. Now, it was advertised as faster than that initially, but that was probably optimistic performance with a long barrel. 2,050 to 2,100 feet per second, probably realistic velocity today. Now, I have talked in the past about how certain cartridges got a reputation for their effectiveness because the bullet available in it happened to perform well at the loaded velocity. I think that is the case here with the 35 Remington and the 200 grain bullet. Now, current factory offerings, Remington makes a 150 grain core lock at 2,300 feet per second, but they also make a 200 grain core lock at 2,080 feet per second. Winchester makes a load with a 200 grain power point at 2,020 feet per second. Federal also offers it in their PowerShock line with a 200 grain PowerShock at 2,080 feet per second. Hornady makes it in their Lever Evolution line with a 200 grain FTX at 2,225 feet per second for about 2,200 foot-pounds of energy. So that's a pretty spicy load for it. I've shot that load basically side by side with the 200 grain core lock, and the Hornady load recoils quite a bit more, but my goodness, it shot accurately out of my rifle. Buffalo Bore also makes heavy, quote-unquote heavy 35 Remington ammo too. Now, Remington initially compared the 35 Remington a lot to the 30-30 in their marketing materials from the early 20th century. A lot of those marketing materials would feature guys, say, facing down a wolf or a big grizzly bear or something like that, and insinuating that, don't worry, this guy is going to be okay because he has a Remington auto-loading rifle in 35 Remington. Now, a typical 35 Remington factory load, right, we'll call it a 200 grain bullet at 2,080 feet per second, has about 5% more muzzle energy than a normal 30-30 factory load. Call it a 170 grain bullet at 2,200 feet per second. The 35 Remington also has a bullet about 18% heavier and with over 35% more frontal surface area. Now, the downside of the cartridge is the 35 Remington did recoil more. It does remain popular today, but it's nothing like a 30-30 though. That's probably because the 30-30 worked well enough for the hunting most people were doing without that extra recoil, so a lot of people just didn't see the need to go up to a 35 Remington. This is a wonderful cartridge for deer, bear, feral hogs, even moose. Now, like I keep saying over and over again, this is not really a long-range cartridge, but it seems to be primarily intended for eastern hunters who just didn't take a lot of shots past 100 yards. And the 35 Remington worked wonderfully in that role. Now, at one time, my dad had Model 8 and Model 81 rifles in all 4 chamberings. I shot several animals with a 35 Remington, including a banger of a hog right after I graduated college with a Remington Model 81. So did he. I really liked this cartridge. I thought it was really unique in those rifles. Funny enough, I've never actually shot a Marlin 336 and 35 Remington. I shot it out of the 8. I shot it out of the 81. I also shot it out of a Remington Model 14 pump action rifle. Now, the Model 14 pump action had a somewhat innovative design in that it had a tubular magazine under the rifle barrel, like, say, a Marlin 336. But instead of stacking the bullets one on top of the other like you have in a traditional tubular magazine, this rifle actually had a spiraling magazine. So you could put a bunch of bullets in there, but you wouldn't have the tip of one resting on the primer of the one in front of it. So you could actually use a pointed bullet in that sort of magazine. Now, of all the rounds I talk about in this episode, I have the most experience with the 35 Remington. It is perfect for a lot of the hunting that I grew up doing out here in East Texas, where shorter range shots were very common. And like I keep saying, it is awesome in that role. All right, next up is the 356 Winchester, and that's not a verbal typo. This cartridge was developed in parallel with the 307 Winchester. As you may recall from episode 286, the 307 Winchester was introduced in 1982. That cartridge used a rimmed case, and it basically gave 300 Savage level performance out of a lever action rifle with a tubular magazine. It is very similar in overall appearance to a 308 Winchester case with a rim and shooting flat-nosed bullets. Well, the 356 Winchester used a very similar design. It also came out in 1982. 52,000 CUP max average pressure with SAAMI. It is 2.56 inches long, has a slight rim on the case, not much taper to it. So while the 307 Winchester looked like a rimmed 308 Winchester that worked in a lever action rifle, this cartridge looks like a 308 Winchester necked up a little bit to 35 caliber, also with a rim, also shooting out of a lever action rifle. Caliber aficionados may realize that this cartridge is very similar to another cartridge we're about to talk about called the 358 Winchester. Just the 356 Winchester has a rim and is a little shorter. That's probably why this cartridge is called the 356 Winchester, even though it shoots .358 caliber bullets. Yes, we will talk more about the 358 Winchester later. But as you can probably imagine, the 356 Winchester was not a big success. It does not offer much to people you cannot get elsewhere. It also has a confusing name. And it also had similar performance to Winchester's already existing 358 Winchester. So the 356 Winchester was discontinued pretty soon after it came on the scene. Compared to the 35 Remington, the 356 Winchester was a higher pressure, slightly larger overall cartridge, and it could shoot the same weight bullet 300 to 400 feet per second faster. It was available in the Marlin 336 ER and the Winchester Model 94 XTR angle eject rifles. There were a couple of factory loads available for it, like a 200-grain bullet at 2,460 feet per second and a 250-grain bullet at 2,160 feet per second. It will do everything a 35 Remington, a 348 Winchester, or similar will do. It's another heavy-hitting woods round, but it's going the way of the dodo bird, though. Finding rifles and ammo is really hard these days. Though Hendershots does list the cartridge in their catalog, aside from really old stuff on Gunbroker, that's the only ammo I could find for it. Okay, next we have the 358 Winchester I just mentioned. Winchester rolled this cartridge out in 1955, and it is basically a 308 necked up to .358 caliber. Has the same max average SAAMI pressure as the .308 Winchester, has a 2.015-inch long case, is 2.78 inches long overall, has a 0.473-inch rim diameter, body designed with very minimal taper. This is a short-action cartridge, just like the .308. Winchester initially offered it in their Model 70 bolt-action and their Model 88 lever-action rifle. It was also available for a time in the Savage Model 99, the Browning lever-action rifle, and the Ruger M77. Wilson Combat has also made some ARs in this cartridge too. I'm sure they are great hog slayers. Now, just as a .308 is a shortened 30-06 and will do almost but not quite what the 30-06 will do in a short-action rifle, well, you can look at the .358 Winchester as basically a shortened .35 Whelen that will do almost but not quite what the larger cartridge will do in a short-action rifle. According to an article I found by Phil Macero, original loads for the .358 Winchester were a 200-grain bullet at 2,530 feet per second or a 250-grain bullet at 2,250 feet per second. This is a cartridge that can really benefit from hand loading. Hornady actually lists a couple of loads in their reloading handbook shooting a 200-grain bullet at 26 or even 2,700 feet per second. That's moving out of a cartridge like this, and that's actually about as fast as the .308 Winchester fires a 165 or 168 grain bullet. And as you'll see here in a minute, that actually compares favorably to the larger .35 Whelen. The .35 Whelen is still more powerful, but the gap is a whole lot more narrow. Now, unfortunately for the .358 Winchester, it got tagged with the quote-unquote woods gun moniker. Now, that is not inaccurate, and it is indeed great in that role, but it did pigeonhole the .358 Winchester in some people's minds. It's no 300 Win Mag or 7 PRC, but the .358 Winchester is also not restricted to shots 200 yards and closer either. In fact, it's actually the most flexible cartridge that we've talked about to this point in this episode. Hornady and Winchester both currently make factory loads for the .358. Hornady lists a 200-grain interlock at 2475. Winchester lists a 200-grain power point at 2490 feet per second. Both the Hornady and Winchester loads are in stock as I record this too. Buffalo Bore also offers some quote-unquote heavy .358 Winchester ammo with among other bullets, a 225-grain TSX and a 225-grain soft point. Like I said, great for use at close range, especially in something like that Model 88 or Model 99 lever action. Craig Boddington actually talks in his book, The Perfect Shot North America, about creeping up to a bedded Sherris moose on a hunt in Wyoming and shooting it in the neck with a Winchester Model 88 and .358 Winchester. That's a great choice for a hunt like that in thick country for larger game. No reason you couldn't use it on something like a black bear, feral hog, or a deer either. Though it does do its best work at closer range, if you have it in something like a Model 70 bolt action, you could certainly take a longer shot with the .358 Winchester. This cartridge came out during a time of tremendous innovation and change in the firearms industry in the 1950s. Stuff started happening fast in the next few years, like the introduction of the 7 Remington Magnum and the 300 Winchester Magnum. Winchester also discontinued their pre-64 Model 70s a few years after the .358 Winchester came out, etc. Lots of rounds hit the market during that time frame. Some hung around, others didn't. The .358 Winchester has not disappeared, but it's also not very popular today either. Next, we have the .35 Whelen. Like I mentioned earlier, this is another really popular, really flexible .35 caliber cartridge. It's basically a 30-06 necked up to .35 caliber. Bearing the name of the famous Townsend Whelen, the .35 Whelen came along in 1922, but it remained a wildcat until Remington legitimized it in 1988. It is a SAAMI standardized cartridge, 62,000 psi max average pressure, 3.34 inches long, 2.494 inch long case, 0.473 inch rim diameter. Common loads fire a 200-grain bullet at about 2,800 feet per second, a 225-grain bullet at around 2,600 feet per second, or a 250-grain bullet at approximately 2,500 feet per second. This cartridge is considerably more powerful than the 30-06, but the 35 Whelen still fits in a standard length action with the same size bolt face as the 30-06. It also filled a gap that existed at the time between the 30-06, originally developed for the Army, and the relatively expensive and difficult to obtain, especially back then, but even now, Magnum cartridges like the 375 H&H. Here's an excerpt from page 692 of Hornady's 10th edition reloading manual that emphasizes that point. At the time of its introduction, a Magnum Mauser action alone cost about the price of 2 complete domestic sporting rifles, and hunters wanting a rifle which would approximate the power of the big 375 H&H had to dig deep into their pockets to achieve that goal. But the 35 Whelen gave hunters a fine, low-cost alternative. The cartridge was short enough to work through standard length 30-06 actions, conversion to the Whelen was simple, and cases could be made easily by running 30-06 brass over a 35 caliber expander plug. Though 35 Whelen performance falls several hundred feet per second short of 375 velocities with comparable bullets, the 35 Whelen is nevertheless a potent, accurate, and dependable medium to big game cartridge. End of quote. So that is how the cartridge got the nickname the Poor Man's Magnum. It was very easy to convert a Springfield rifle or any other 30-06 rifle to the cartridge. The same was also true with 30-06 brass, both of which were widely available in the USA. All you needed was some .358 caliber bullets, which were available as component bullets originally designed for some of the other 35 caliber cartridges of the day, like the 35 Remington I mentioned earlier. Now, in terms of rifle availability now, you can get a single-shot break-action CVA Scout. Adam Weiss, better known as Hootie, who actually brought one of those rifles in 35 Whelen to Colorado, and he killed a bison on a hunt with me in 2022. It is available in the Ruger M77. You can also get it in a converted Springfield or Mauser rifle. My grandfather actually had a Mauser rebarreled 235 Whelen. He used it to kill the giant deer that's on the wall behind me you see in some of my YouTube videos. For factory loads available right now, Barnes makes a load with 180 grain TTSX at 2,900. They also make a 200 grain TTSX load at 2,700 feet per second. Federal makes a load with a 200 grain Fusion at 2,800 feet per second. Hornady makes a load with a 200 grain bullet at 2,910 feet per second. Nosler makes a load with a 225 grain AccuBond at 2,700 feet per second. Remington makes a load with a 200 grain core lock and a 250 grain core lock. Winchester makes a load with a 200 grain PowerPoint at 2,800 feet per second also. So this is a well-designed, very flexible, very balanced cartridge. Solid performer, still fairly popular as well. If I am not mistaken, at this instant, Ruger offers their M77 Hawkeye African in 35 Whelen 2. They change out the offerings in some of their rifles from year to year, but at least here in 2025, that is another rifle option for the cartridge. This is a wonderful choice for taking to Africa for plains game. Mike Arnold actually used a rifle chambered in 35 Whelen Ackley improved to kill a Cape buffalo on a hunt several years ago. Now that cartridge falls short of the 375 caliber minimum some countries have, but if you're hunting in a country that does not have a caliber minimum for dangerous game, but does have a minimum energy threshold, the 35 Whelen Ackley improved will barely get across that 4,000 foot-pounds of energy minimum threshold. And he said it worked fine for him on that buffalo too. But really, plains game, for the most part, is where that cartridge is most at home in Africa. I'd shoot anything up to and including a big eland with a 35 Whelen, and it's got enough velocity, a flat enough trajectory, enough flexibility. You can use it up close in the bush. You can use it on a more open hunt where you need to take a shot at something a couple hundred yards away. You could use this cartridge like my grandfather did, kill a big whitetail deer in South Texas with it. You could use it on an elk hunt. You can use it on moose, black bear, basically anything that you would be hunting in North America, it'll work for that too. You can use it in Europe on stag or bears over there, whatever. Wonderful cartridge for really anything this side of thick-skinned, dangerous game. And yeah, it works great up close, but it's not restricted to that. Really, of everything I talk about in this episode, the 35 Whelen is the cartridge I would tell you to go for if you want a big hammer to hit stuff with and you want several hundred yards of effective range without too much recoil. Yeah, it does have stout-ish recoil, but it's not terrible either. Next, we have the 350 Rigby. That name actually can refer to 3 different cartridges. None of them are SAAMI standardized, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about them here. So the first cartridge was the 400 350 Rigby, also known as the 400 350 Nitro Express. This was a 400 Purdy, neck down 235 caliber. This cartridge came along in 1899. It fired a 310 grain bullet at 2,100 feet per second for just over 3,000 foot-pounds of energy. It had an incredible sectional density of .346. As you can probably imagine, it penetrated like crazy. This was a very popular, very effective medium-bore cartridge in Africa in the early 20th century. A lot of people loved it, most notably John Taylor did. Here are a couple of stories from his book, African Rifles and Cartridges, where he uses this cartridge. First one is on a couple of lions. I quote, "It was using this rifle I killed 2 lions with a single shot. I was returning from a successful elephant hunt and still had a solid bullet in the chamber because there were rhino about. I was not thinking about lions at all when I suddenly saw 2 of them standing broadside on, shoulder to shoulder, but facing in opposite directions and gazing at me. I would have substituted a soft nose for the full patch bullet, but could see that I had a splendid chance to bag them both with one shot as they stood, using the solid bullet to ensure enough penetration to kill both and not merely wound the second one. So I let drive before they had made up their minds as to what we were. The full patch 310 grain bullet went clean through all 4 shoulders. They both reacted in an identical manner. Their tails and hindquarters arched up over their backs. They lurched forward and collapsed alongside one another, still facing in opposite directions." End of quote. Now, a few paragraphs later, John Taylor talks about having this same rifle with him on a hunt. While they were out walking, nature called. He leaned the rifle against the side of a tree, squatted down, starting to do his business, and then some eland appeared. So here's John Taylor again. "I slowly reached out a hand and got hold of my rifle, mighty glad I had long made it an unbreakable rule never to allow it to be beyond arm's reach no matter what the circumstances. As I brought it to my shoulder, the movement must have caught the nearer bull's eye. He was not more than 10 paces away. One startled look he gave in my direction, his eyes going straight into mine, then he slewed around to go. The 310 grain soft-nosed bullet took him about 4 inches below the anus as he was getting into his stride directly away from me. He lurched forward and, with his hind legs wide apart, stumbled along for possibly 2.5 times his own length and then fell. Reloading the instant I had fired, I stood up and swung on the second bull. My pants around my ankles pretty well anchored me, but the second bull galloped up the rise opposite and then halted when he reached the crest and stood broadside on as he looked back to see why his companion wasn't following. My bullet took him through the shoulder at a range of about 35 yards, brought him down to his tracks. He scrabbled around for a moment, but was unable to get to his feet again and was dead before I was ready to close in. These were both similar soft-nosed bullets, and I would like to draw the reader's attention to the fact that both these immense bulls were killed with one shot apiece, one being placed in the stern, the other through the shoulder blade. In neither case did the bullet pass clean through the animal. Both bullets were perfectly mushroomed. Neither had lost any weight. Personally, I consider that Rigby's original 350 makes a better all-around rifle than his modern Magnum for African use. There's no getting away from the fact that its 310 grain bullet hits a heavier punch on a head-on shot than does the 225 grain bullet thrown by the Magnum, whilst its trajectory is as flat as you could possibly want in Africa. Okay, this is me again. We'll talk about the Rigby Magnum here in a second, but as you can see, that's pretty impressive penetration with the old 400 350 Rigby. He talks about shooting buffalo, rhino, elephant with that cartridge, and it worked great. Now, I mentioned 2 other Rigby cartridges. John Taylor alluded to them at the end of that blurb I just read you. Now, Rigby also introduced the 350 Rigby Magnum and the 350 No. 2 Rigby in 1908. As was the case with some other cartridges, Rigby produced a rimmed and a rimless version of the same round. That's what those 2 cartridges were. Both fired a lighter bullet at a higher velocity than the old 400 350 Rigby. The rimless round fired a 225 grain bullet at 2625 feet per second. The rimmed cartridge fired a 225 grain bullet at a little bit slower velocity of 2575 feet per second. Both were also very popular. They did end up overtaking the 400 350 Rigby in terms of popularity. Taylor, even though he said he preferred the original 350 Rigby, he did also like the newer ones. He said the soft point was good on plains game, and the steel-covered solid was good on thicker-skinned game. He also had a story about shooting 2 other eland with the newer cartridge. I quote from his same book, "An incident or 2 showed me that I need not have worried about the seeming lightness of the bullet. I remember I was stalking a herd of eland one day. Eland are the biggest of all the antelopes, a big bull running close to a ton on the hoof. These big beasts are usually on the alert, and if anything goes wrong with your first stalk and they get wise to your presence, you will be very lucky to get a shot, and you will not get it without an immense amount of very hard hunting. It was a pretty big herd I was after. I judged there must have been 40 or 50 of them. I knew I was in for a long, hard hunt, as there would now be plenty of very keen eyes on the lookout for me. And so it proved. A couple of times I was spotted when they had halted and were looking back, and I was endeavoring to make a detour so as to get ahead of them. Eventually, they led me to 2 fairly high kopjes, passing up over the shoulder on one, then dropping down into a low ground between them and commencing to climb the other. As I came over the shoulder of the nearer hill, I saw the herd stretching out in a single file as they climbed the side of the other kopje. It was a long shot for me. I figured it was all of 225 yards, and I wondered how my little 225 grain, semi-pointed, soft-nosed slug would behave at that range on such mighty animals. On account of the angle at which the herd was climbing the opposite slope, I was unable to place the bullet on the shoulder, but aimed just behind the shoulder and about halfway up between the center of the body and the line of the back to allow for the bullet drop. I hoped the bullet would drive through lungs and heart and bring up against the opposite shoulder as it raked diagonally through. As the eland were climbing slowly, not having sighted me, I took my time and made sure of the shot. On receipt of the bullet, the big leading bull at which I had fired gave a convulsive leap forward and then put up the grandest fight I have ever seen to regain his feet. It was like a fine boxer out on his feet but refusing to go down. The bull was unable to hold his altitude, and he struggled and scrambled and lurched down the side of the kopje to finally sink to his knees and roll over. Rapidly reloading, I aimed for the second big bull just as he made up his mind that he knew of a healthier spot and started a lumbering gallop up the side of the hill, and the rest of the herd streamed after him. Taking the same aim, but holding forward, I let him have it. He pitched forward on his nose, rolled over sideways, scrabbled to his feet, staggered, fell, came rolling down the hillside. I let the rest go. I traced both of these bullets to see what happened to them. They had both been perfectly placed and, as I had hoped, had driven in through lungs and heart to pull up against the inside of the off shoulder. In the case of the first bull, the nicely mushroomed slug was found against the inner side of the shoulder, but in the case of the second one, it had smashed the bone. I reckoned it was a mighty fine work for 2 such light bullets, and I was correspondingly pleased with my rifle. End of quote. So it sounds like a couple of great cartridges for use on all manner of game in Africa. Now, the problem with them now is that they fall short of the .375 caliber minimum some countries have. And it's also darn near impossible to find rifles and or ammo for the .350 Rigby cartridges. Next up, we have the 350 Remington Magnum. This was the original short Magnum cartridge. Remington introduced it all the way back in 1965. It is basically the belted H&H case necked up to 35 caliber and shortened. Now, this was a short-action cartridge designed for use out of a short barrel. The idea was to have a short, handy, yet heavy-hitting rifle that more or less mimicked the 35 Whelen in terms of performance. This is a SAAMI standardized round, 53,000 CUP max average pressure. Short, fat design. Has a belted case, 2.8 inches long, 0.532 inch rim diameter, 2.78 inch long maximum overall length. So a little bit shorter than a 308 Winchester, but quite a bit fatter. Phil Massaro said in an article he wrote for American Hunter, original ballistics of the cartridge were a 200 grain core lock at about 2,700 feet per second, and a 250 grain core lock at about 2,400 feet per second. Cartridges of the World says that the cartridge was introduced in 1965 for the Model 600 bolt-action carbine. This rifle had an 18-inch long barrel. They introduced a 20-inch long barrel for it in 1968. Both were discontinued in 1971. They offered it in the Model 700 until 1974. Ruger also offered some rifles in it. It was also available for a short period of time in the Remington 673 Guide rifle. This cartridge had lots of recoil, lots of muzzle blast, especially in those lighter rifles. It was not very popular and quickly fell by the wayside. Now, sort of like the 300 Ruger Compact Magnum and the 338 Ruger Compact Magnum, the 350 Remington Magnum was perhaps ahead of its time. For instance, I could see that cartridge getting more traction if suppressors were more popular back then. So someone could get a rifle with an 18-inch long barrel, put a suppressor on it, that would really tame that muzzle blast and the recoil of it, and it would still be really heavy hitting, and yet it would still be a reasonably compact rifle, even with a suppressor attached. This is certainly a versatile round. It certainly works. You can really hammer something up close with it, but it's also fast enough that it has enough reach where you could take a shot at a couple 100 yards with it. But people spoke with their wallets. They liked the 35 Whelen. It's still around, but the 350 Remington, which purported to give you 35 Whelen performance out of a shorter barrel, really isn't. It's fading fast, never was a big seller. Remington discontinued ammo sales in the 1990s. Nosler used to make a load with a 225 grain partition at about 2550 feet per second, so you're getting about 3,200 foot-pounds of energy. Choice Ammo does offer a load now with a 250 grain partition at about 2,500 feet per second. Hindershots does list it in their catalog too with 180, 200, 225 grain Barnes bullets, 250 grain Norma Oryx, 200 grain soft point from Hornady, and some hammer bullets as well. All right, next up we have the 35 Newton. This is not a SAAMI standardized cartridge. It was introduced in the early 1900s, basically a 30 Newton necked up to 35 caliber. Phil Sharp had this to say about it in his book, The Rifle in America. Around 1916, Charles Newton introduced this 35 Newton cartridge for use only in his own rifle. No commercial rifle other than the Newton has ever been chambered for this big number and is rapidly falling into the discard, although ammunition is still commercially manufactured by the Western Cartridge Company. The 35 Newton has a large capacity case with a surplus of powder and plenty of recoil. It will handle any of the North American big and dangerous game. It is a bit too powerful for such game as deer and small bear. The 250 grain hollow point bullet, as loaded by Western, is driven at a muzzle velocity of 2,670 feet per second. End of quote. And here is a blurb about it from Cartridges of the World. The 35 Newton is more powerful in some loadings than the 375 H&H Magnum. The factory load listed was the last one offered by the Western Cartridge Company. Stepping outside of this paragraph, they're referring to a 250 grain factory load at 2975 feet per second. Okay, continuing. But at one time, other loads were available. This cartridge is overpowered for most North American big game. It has been used in Africa with considerable success, although the Newton rifle was much too light and poorly stocked for such a powerful cartridge. Cases can be readily formed from RWS 8x68mm brass or by necking up the 30 Newton, itself a scarce item. Performance is similar to the later .358 Norma Magnum, which would be a far better choice because ammunition has been recently offered and hand loading is easier through a simple conversion of readily available cases. End of quote. Now, I have remarked on the podcast in the past that Charles Newton was in many ways ahead of his time. The cartridges he designed were cool and innovative, but like they mentioned there, had some issues with the rifles. He also had some manufacturing issues and just some bad luck along the way. All of his cartridges have gone by the wayside. Now, flinging a 250-grain soft-point bullet at darn near 3,000 feet per second is impressive. That is super fast, but considering the quality and construction of bullets they had available at the time, I would wager you're really running the risk of poor bullet performance at those sort of velocities. I'm going to share a story about that when we talk about the next cartridge, which is the .358 Norma. Now, Norma introduced this cartridge in 1959. It has a 3.34-inch long belted case, 0.513-inch rim diameter, looks like a 300 H&H necked up to .35 caliber, shortened and with the body taper removed. Norma currently makes one factory load shooting a 250-grain bullet at 2,790 feet per second for about 4,300 foot-pounds of energy. Double Tap also makes a couple of loads for this cartridge, 225-grain A-frame at 3,000 feet per second, 250-grain A-frame at about 2,800 feet per second, 280-grain A-frame at 2,650 feet per second. All of those loads are giving you 43, 44, 4,500 foot-pounds of energy. So that's right up there, 375 H&H level performance. Now that current Norma factory load, along with those A-frames I just talked about, are tough bullets. They can handle that velocity. That was not always the case, though, especially considering this cartridge came out in the late 1950s. Here's a story from Art Alphen's book, Any Shot You Want, that illustrates this point, along with the fact that there is more to a cartridge's performance than what you read on paper. So he's talking about the .358 Norma Magnum here. I quote, "I took the rifle to Africa in 1978. Unbeknownst to me at the time, the problem with the .358 Norma Magnum and all high-velocity .35 caliber cartridges was the fact that available 200 and 250 grain bullets were designed for the 2,000 to 2,300 foot-per-second velocities of the .35 Remington and .358 Winchester. Compounding the problem, these bullets were designed for North American animals, which have a higher percentage of body fat and a lighter bone structure than the more sturdy African animals. The rifle and cartridge proved a spectacular failure. Bullets disintegrated and, despite their greater cross-sectional area, did not kill anywhere near as well as the .338 Winchester or even the .300 Magnums. It all nearly proved my undoing when I hit a sable broadside. The animal dropped as if he had been pole-axed. I made the crucial error of checking the sable for death and then turning my back on him when I assumed it was all over. A snort and a shuffle alerted me to turn around. Only luck and a fast reaction time got me out of the way as he sliced with his horns. Grasping a horn in one hand and the rifle in the other, I thrust the muzzle up against his chest and pulled the trigger. The bullet, predictably, failed. He and I both backed up. I was working the bolt when my gun bearer arrived with my M14. It was during the Rhodesian War and allowed me to sort the sable out. After that incident and a few others, I put the .358 Norma Magnum away and never looked back." End of quote. All right, there's a lot of threads we can pull from that story. I could add that to my episode number 349 on bullet failures. It would also dovetail quite nicely with my recent interview, episode 357, with Kevin Robertson about sable and about how tough they are and about how aggressive they can be. And of course, this also emphasizes the importance of using a tough bullet if you are shooting a higher velocity cartridge like the .358 Norma. Now, Art does go on in that section of his book to talk about how things have changed quite a bit with bullet quality since that hunt. Back in 1978, you had a Nosler partition, and that was about it. But now we have access to stuff like the various Barnes bullets, the Swift A-frame, the trophy bonded Bear Claw, and of course the A-square dead tough bullet that Art himself helped design and champion. Now, funny enough, despite Art Alphen's poor personal experience with that Sable he described in the book, his company, the A-squared company, helped revive the .358 Norma Magnum after they started producing ammo loaded with more appropriate bullets for the high velocities the cartridge was capable of. That said, while the cartridge didn't really die, it's still not doing great today. Terry Whelen had this to say about it. If there is one cartridge in the world that I love, undeservedly, but with a tragic pointlessness, it is the .358 Norma Magnum. Now, this is me talking here. This cartridge occupies that no man's land between the .338s and the .375. It's not big enough to use on dangerous game in countries with that 9.2 millimeter or .375 caliber minimum. It's a lot more powerful than what you need for use on smaller game. It also has lots of recoil. Really, the niche this cartridge works best in is bigger animals, moose, nogai, larger African plains game, etc. You don't necessarily need this cartridge for hunting those animals, but it really works in that role. But because it occupies such a small niche, it's not super popular, and it seems like it's slowly fading away. Okay, we have one last cartridge to talk about, and that is the .35 Nosler. What's that? You've never heard of the .35 Nosler? Well, this is actually a SAAMI standardized cartridge. The folks at Nosler built it using the same formula as the other Nosler cartridges. 30-06 length cartridge with a fat beltless case, 0.555-inch case head diameter, 65,000 psi max SAAMI average pressure. They say it can shoot a 225 grain bullet at 3,000 feet per second for about just under 4,500 foot-pounds of energy. So very similar performance to the .358 Norma, just uses a fatter beltless case. As far as I can tell, Nosler seems to have gotten this cartridge standardized through SAAMI, but they just never produce factory rifles or ammo for it. Maybe they got it SAAMI standardized while submitting some other rounds and just held on to it just in case they ever decided to produce rifles or ammo for it. They do currently produce a 225 grain partition, a 225 grain Accubon, and a 250 grain partition that they could foreseeably use in a .35 Nosler if they ever decided to run with it. This is a whopper of a cartridge, but it has ballistics almost identical to the .33 Nosler. And that's probably why they never really released the .35 Nosler or tried to promote it. Now, for what it's worth, there's also a SAAMI standardized .36 Nosler 2, built using the same formula, just shooting a .366 caliber bullet. In this case, SAAMI specs say a 250 grain bullet at 2925 feet per second. That's about 4,750 foot-pounds of energy. That's a 9.3 by 62 on steroids. Okay, that was the last cartridge. Now, I talked about 15 cartridges in this episode. 8 for Winchester. That's the .348 Winchester, .357 Magnum, .35 Winchester, .35 Winchester self-loading, .351 Winchester self-loading, .356 Winchester, .358 Winchester, .350 Legend. 4 cartridges for Remington. .35 Remington, .350 Remington Magnum, .35 Whelen, and .360 Buckhammer. Then we had the .35 Nosler, the .350 Rigby, and the .358 Norma that were all one-offs. Now, I'm not quite sure what the future holds for the .35 caliber bore diameter. Now, the .350 Legend and .360 Buckhammer were both pretty successful, but they also took advantage of some legal restrictions that created a market need. They filled it with rounds that didn't suffer from the biggest shortcomings of the .35 caliber either, which is recoil. So the .35 caliber bore diameter occupies something of a weird space. Lower powered rounds in this area, like the .350 Legend and .35 Remington, are effective up close on game like deer, and recoil isn't too bad, but they're not very flexible cartridges. More powerful stuff like the .358 Winchester, .35 Whelen, and especially the .358 Norma are more effective on a wider spectrum of game, and you can use them effectively at longer ranges, but they recoil more. And really, I wouldn't say they do things enough better than something like a .308 or a 30-06 that their shortcomings can be overlooked. And this also goes back to the comparison I did between the .30-30 Winchester and the .35 Remington earlier. Yeah, the .35 Remington is a little bigger and a little bit more powerful, but it also recoils a little more. But the .30-30 also works just fine, so why would someone need something more powerful? Why would they want to deal with that extra recoil if they didn't have to? And additionally, even the really powerful .35 calibers, for the most part, do not meet the legal threshold for hunting thick-skinned, dangerous game in Africa. So if you want a really big stick for hunting at shorter range for whatever reason, like if you do a lot of hunting for moose or black bear or even deer, or if you live in Alaska or something like that and you might have an encounter with a brown bear or a grizzly bear, then yeah, many of these cartridges will work in that role. If you want a cartridge you can use for a wider spectrum of game and situations, then there are just simply better choices. Sort of like I described in episode 338 when I talked about the .33 caliber cartridges, it seems like the advent of better quality bullets and the increase in popularity of long-range shooting has really hurt the .35 caliber bore diameter. I mean, when all you had were real simple cup and core bullets, you could make an argument that a .33 caliber or a .35 caliber cartridge shooting those larger diameter, really heavy bullets was more effective than a smaller caliber cartridge. But that's not nearly as true today. However, I will say the popularity of suppressors that keeps growing might spur some continued development here. Perhaps we'll see a hammer of a .35 caliber round designed for use with subsonic ammo in the near future, maybe like a 8.6 Blackout or the .338 ARC. Maybe we'll see a .35 ARC or something like that. But we'll just have to see. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now, if you are listening to this episode on Spotify, be sure to answer the poll for this episode and choose your favorite .35 caliber cartridge. Also, be sure to check out my .30 caliber episode, number 286, my .270 episode, 291, my 9.3 and 375 cal episode, 297, my 40 and 50 caliber plus episodes with Kevin Robertson, 300 and 329, my 25 caliber episode, which is 328, my 33 caliber episode, which is 338, and my 7mm episode, 345. Drop me a line, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com. Please send any feedback you have on this episode. Let me know if you want more, if you want a 22 cal, a 6mm, a 6.5mm episode, etc. Finally, I'd like to extend an invitation to you to join the community I am building on Patreon at patreon.com/biggamehunter or at the link in the show notes. I release special member-only content there pretty regularly, like the results of some ballistic gel tests and ammo comparisons. I also prioritize correspondence with my supporters on Patreon above anyone else. Anyone can email me with questions, but Patreon supporters get priority. I also offer some other cool bonuses to supporters there, so sign up at the link in the show notes. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.